Hello, and welcome to the official podcast of the Cleveland International Film Festival, SIF Speaks, sponsored by Wayside Furniture. I'm Dee Perry, and I'm joined by my co-host and producer, Aaron Spears. And Aaron, today is the first full day of film festival screenings in person at Playhouse Square. And from now through April 9th, SIF 46 is going to present hundreds of opportunities to explore experiences we might not have learned of otherwise and hear stories that need to be told.
Very, very true, Dee. And today we're going to talk about a film that shares both a compelling experience and a very moving story, the documentary Free Renty, Lanier versus Harvard. And joining us now to discuss that film is the director, David Grubin, and its main subject, Tammy Lanier.
And I want to start, Tammy, with the fact that throughout the film you talk about how you and your children grew up hearing the stories about your ancestor, Papa Renty, from your mother, Mattie Pearl Thompson. What did she want you to know about him? What did she want you to grow up with?
Well, it was important for her that we knew our family legacy, our family history, but in doing so and sharing that, she would always start with Papa Renty. He was the patriarch. He was the Black African. He was the proud African. And the oral history of who he was and the amazing things that he accomplished. And one of the things that my mom was most proud of was the fact that he was literate. And not only was he taught himself to read, but he also taught others at a time when that was illegal to do and could result in some kind of consequences for him, obviously negative consequences, but that he did it anyway. And she had a special reverence for him because of the stories of who he was, the religion, the kind of community person. And so, our oral history was important, but she would always start with Papa Renty. That was the jump off point.
And I wondered too, how the stories were passed to her. Did she talk about that? Was it a word for word sort of oral history that kept going from generation to generation?
Before I answer that, I want to share that I'm not that many generations removed from slavery. My mother was raised in the household with her enslaved ancestors. Her grandfather was also Renty, who was born a slave, who lived many years as a slave, and made it a point to share that and those life experiences with his children. So really, my mother heard firsthand, and I'm hearing secondhand, these stories. And the other amazing thing is all of the oral history and the stories that my mom talked about after her death, when I'm going back and doing the genealogical research, I like to frame it as my mother left me a blueprint, because as I trace back, exactly what she says matches perfectly with the records that she never saw. It was almost as if she was telling us from these documents. She never saw them, but that's how accurate our oral history was.
So David, looking up your IMDb profile after watching this movie, I realized, one, I'd seen a couple of your docs already, and you have an amazing body of documentary work you've done throughout the years that I think the trend I was noticing was really a good focus on history specifically. So I was really curious how you first heard about this case and what compelled you. Were like, okay, this is the next project. Got to do this one.
Well, honestly, I had a very special connection to this story because it's Tammy's lawyer, Mike Koskoff, who told me about it, and he's my cousin.
Oh.
He said, we're going to do this together. And of course, he doesn't make it. He didn't know. I didn't know that he was so, he discovered after the first week of our filming, he found out that he was diagnosed with cancer, and he managed to get through the beginning stages. He died after the lawsuit was filed, but he managed to get to that point. But it was Mike who told me about this story and said, I think you're going to be interested. And I said, well, it's a great story. It's so relevant. It's so important, but I have to meet Tammy Lanier. He said, come around. And, as soon as you meet Tammy, you want to do this story because you see how determined she is, and you see this is a person who's honest and who has integrity, and she's going to stay with it. She's not going to give up. I should say the other thing is looking into the eyes of Papa Renty, as Tammy calls him, and we came to call him. You see that daguerreotype, and you know that this is a story that has to be told. That's the most moving image, and it speaks across the decades and the decades, and you know you want to do it.
The daguerreotypes of Papa Renty and others are held at Harvard's Peabody Museum. How did you learn about these images?
It's just an amazing story, and there's a lot. The film is like an hour and a half or 96 minutes, but then there is another 96 minutes that haven't been told. And one of the important parts of the story is how I came to recognize the daguerreotypes or discover them. One of the things that was obvious about my mom and her sharing these stories was that it gave her peace. My kids could walk into either her hospital room or her nursing room, and when they say, "Grandma, tell us that story about Papa Renty," it's as if peace came over her, that all was right with the world, and that all of the things that she was worrying about no longer existed, and she would settle into this storytelling mode. And we started encouraging her to talk about it because it gave her such a peace. And so when my mom passed, I had such regret because I had promised that I would write these things down. Some of my last conversations with her when she was lucid was about writing these things down. And so I have never broken a promise to my mom. And so I said, I have to find a way to do this genealogical project. And also keeping in mind that we're talking about 2010. And the internet isn't what it is today, and access to information isn't what it is today. I happened to be out at lunch, and I went out for a walk during my lunch break, and I stopped into this small little ice cream shop that was owned and operated by this senior citizen. His name was Rich Morrison. I didn't know him. We just talked and exchanged pleasantries when I would pay for my lunch. And one day, I went in that day, I said to him, "Did I tell you that my mom had passed?" And he said, "No." And then I was telling him about this promise that I had made to her to do this genealogical research, and I didn't know how to do it. I'll never forget, he said, "Write down what you know, and I'll do the research." And I remember looking at him because he was like 80 years old at the time, maybe. And I'm thinking, okay, most seniors at that time didn't even know how to turn on a computer, let alone navigate the internet and do the research. So I'm like, okay, I'll just play along. And so I remember talking to him about Papa Renty and about the stories of him being the Black African, giving him children's names and the names that I could recall, and leaving and not really thinking anything of it. A couple of weeks went by, but when I walked in, he threw his hands up and he says, "Where have you been? I found your Papa Renty on the internet." And I'm like, "Yeah, right. What's my Papa Renty doing on the internet?" And I still didn't have any confidence that he had found anything usable or meaningful. And so we exchanged for the first time our names and our email addresses and our telephone numbers. And he wrote it on a little piece of paper, and I still have it here somewhere. But I went back to work, and later that evening, when I got home, I said, "Let me take a look at what Rich put together." And he put together a very comprehensive document, starting with Louis Agassiz and the scientific racism. And I'm like, oh my gosh, why is he sending me this? This is really strange stuff. And so I'm reading, and then the next attachment I opened was a picture of Papa Renty. I knew immediately that he was my Papa Renty. And I remember thinking, oh my God, this is the man that I have heard so much about for my entire life. I remember calling my children in to come see the image and saying, "This is Papa Renty." And my oldest daughter, I'll never forget what she said. She said, "Based on the stories that Grandma had told, I created an image of Papa Renty in my head of a man 10 feet tall." And here's this small person. And she says, but I see the family resemblance. And we started talking about what we recognized in our family that he reminded us of. And I remember connecting with his eyes, and like we just stared at each other for moments. And I remember thinking, then it dawned on me, like, oh, this ugly race science. And so like, oh, so now I'm, the excitement and joy about seeing the image. Now I'm grappling with how the image came to be and how they were used as scientific subjects. And I'm like, oh my God. And I remembered having these mixed emotions about my mom, because she never saw him either. She just loved to talk about him. And I remember thinking, if I had this, would I show it to her? Would I tell her? Because she loved this man so much. He was the patriarch of her family. Every story started with him, but it would hurt her to her core to know how this came to be. And so I wrestled with, would my mom want to see it or not? I wrestled with, what would she want me to do about it? And so, in those moments, I decided that I had to right the wrong that was created when they created the daguerreotypes.
And you've been on an 11-year journey since that time, trying to grapple with Harvard's resistance. And David, you saw and used those images of Renty, his daughter Delia, and another father-daughter, Jack and Jem, extensively in the film. And I was reading that when others, like the photographer Carrie Weems, tried to reference those images in their own work, Harvard threatened to sue. So I was curious if you ran into resistance from them in the course of making this film.
Yeah, well, the resistance was so strong that they wouldn't be in the film. They wouldn't let me talk to any of the professors. And of course, they wouldn't let me talk to the president. I only got to talk to the public relations person who said that we won't talk to you. They stonewalled the film. And I realized, okay, there are great professors at Harvard, but this is a corporation. And as a corporation, they don't want to deal with this. Why don't they want to deal with this? Well, there are 30 million objects that they hold in their museums. And this would open the door. This would open it up. And they don't want to. They don't want people to know this story. And so they just shut it down. And I think the other piece of it is that they don't have an argument other than a very legalistic argument. In other words, for a moral argument, for an institution that is supposed to be, teaching the next generation, they don't have anything to teach them except to say, on narrow legal grounds, we think we own this. That's what the president said. The law is on our side. And, if the law is on their side, it doesn't make for a very good argument from a moral point of view. So I think that's also why they didn't want to talk to me. They had nothing to say.
Sorry, I was trying to just grapple with that's what floodgates would be opened if all the, like you said, the 30 million, that's, yeah. How many cans of worms would be open and how much, Oh, wow. That's staggering.
One of the Harvard law students wrote a brief and he captioned it, Harvard archives bear strange fruits. And he was also an archivist. He's now a law student. But one of the things since the filing of our complaint, Harvard has come forward and acknowledged that they're still holding the human remains of Native American and formerly enslaved people, which is illegal, with the Native American Repatriation Act. And the other thing is, it's important, I think, for your listeners to understand that we believe the law is on our side. We believe that this is plundered property. These are outgrowth of slavery, and the law is very clear in terms of when Harvard commissioned these daguerreotypes, it was illegal to do. And not only that, but Delia and Renty as crime victims have certain property rights that are inherent because not only, their images were taken from them, but they were violated because, again, this was against the law. So there's a lot. I know that Harvard, I typically say that, they're gaslighting us and gaslighting the public. But when we finally do have our day in court and these things can be vetted out, I think it will be clear that the law is truly on our side.
Well, let's stick with that for a minute to go back to the origin of it. You did decide to sue Harvard for the return of the images, but weren't immediately finding anyone to take the case. Why do you think some of the lawyers shied away from it?
Well, and one of the things that was picked about in the film is, firstly, the concern of a 200-year-old case involving property rights of former or of enslaved people is a challenge in itself. But beyond that, when people hear about this case or when they heard about the case, it was immediately linked to reparations. And early on, even as recent as 2019, it wasn't an easy conversation to have. So when you talk to an attorney about bringing a 200-year-old case involving slavery and property rights and reparations, very few are going to jump on board with that.
David, you talked about the resistance of no one wanting to speak about this at Harvard, but I was curious if anyone had agreed, what would you want to know from them? What questions would you have asked?
Well, first, I would have asked the professors the kind of questions that I asked the professors from Brown, because they could tell that story. I think it's important to see how, for Harvard, this ties into a tradition that they don't want people to know about, which is the racist tradition that lots of those schools, those Ivy League schools, those old schools had. That would have been exposed. I would have been asking them about that. Agassi, the so-called scientist who taught at Harvard, commissioned those daguerreotypes. He taught the next generation and the next generation. In other words, eugenics comes out of this kind of thinking. And those guys were at Harvard. So there's a tradition that you would have exposed and would have brought out. So all of that needed to be, they would have had to talk about it. And I don't think they were ready to talk about it. If you're going to really confront your past, you have to confront it. You can't just say, we'll put a plaque up and we'll make some speeches and it'll go away. You have to really deal with it. And that will help to heal. So it makes me doubt their real desire to heal and to get at the roots of it, because they won't deal with Tammy in this case.
David, I also wanted to ask too, right when you start the film, so folks that are going to watch the film, there's this great opening quote that I'd never heard before: until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. It was like, that is a great quote. Like we're in for a story here. I was wondering, was that just a quote you were aware of beforehand, or did you find it during filming, or why did you choose to start it that way?
Well, I'll tell you exactly where I found it. It was on Tammy's business card.
All right.
So I got that from Tammy. I think it's Tammy's story.
And it just encapsulated Papa Renty's story. And, he needed his own historian.
Absolutely. And once you see the entire film, I was like, that is the perfect way you start this documentary.
Right.
Well, the question is, who owns the history?
Exactly.
And Harvard can't be the sole possessor of the history. And that's the way they've been positioning it. They put out a book about the daguerreotypes, and they don't call the book the Agassi daguerreotypes, the man who commissioned them. They call it the Zeely daguerreotypes. Zeely was a photographer, but he wasn't an art photographer taking art pictures. He was commissioned to take pictures for so-called scientific purposes so that Agassi could measure them. So to call the book the Zeely daguerreotypes, it's not history. It's not the history. It's not.
Yeah,
right.
it's sort of a misdirection by Harvard. Say, don't look over here. Look over here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Wow.
And mind you, the daguerreotypes were up until recently in the School of Zoology. This was not about photography. This was a scientific experiment to prove white supremacy.
And that was Agassiz' stated purpose when he said to Harvard, let me do this. And they said, yeah, go ahead. Hmm. Tammy, given that so much of the battle in Free Renty is about those images not being in their control or your control, I'm curious how you feel about all the images of you that are out there now as you've been fighting this. You've been captured in many different ways.
Yeah. Well, for me, what's most important is truth telling. And before we can have the reconciliation, we have to have the truth. And nothing is more important and more compelling than seeing the images. I have often had, and I've actually wrestled with this a lot about the exposure of the images. Certainly the enslaved people who have been captured in the daguerreotypes have been exploited. And so I am often asked as to, my campaign to free Renty is that, by giving it such attention and the images becoming more and more accessible, isn't that in fact exploiting them even more? And so, and I wrestle with that because I know if I were Delia or Drana, I would not want my body exposed for the world to see. But then I think of the greater good and the purpose of not only this story, but this journey and the need for reconciliation. We can't understand the extent of the harm unless we see the full injury. And so we have to look at these, and it's difficult to do, but we have to look at these so that we understand the extent of the harm that was caused by slavery. If we never look, we'll never have a true grasp on that. So I think in spite of, and certainly, the exploitation, there is a greater purpose, and that is to understand the horrors of slavery. And we have to look, we have to see it so that we can understand it.
I just want to add, I really am grateful for Tammy for that decision. And that's why we acknowledge in the film through Tina Camp, a great historian at Brown, that this is an issue. It is something to talk about. And somebody might have made another decision. Tina agrees with Tammy that these are images that should be seen. We have to really understand what happened. And she ends by saying a very moving thing is that she says, when you see them, you realize these are human beings that have been exploited, human beings, they're people. And that more than anything else, when you look at, as I say, when you look in the eyes of Papa Renty, how can you deny his humanity? And how can you not empathize with him as a fellow human when the purpose of the pictures was to say he wasn't?
I also, I've responded in the past to reporters who have asked that with the notion that if Emmett Till's mom had had a closed casket, the world may never have known his name. And so even though, and again, she was accused of exploiting her son by opening that casket to the world. But, people are still fighting for justice for Emmett Till because of those images. So it's important that we see the pain inflicted and the injury.
Absolutely. I wanted to ask a question, trying not to spoil the ending of the film, because I, for one, did not know this story before seeing the film. I hadn't caught it in the news. It slipped by me. Do you want to address where the court case is at now, or?
Well, let me say as a filmmaker part of the story, because for the filmmaker, the narrative of the story is driven by the lawsuit, right? What's going to happen? Is Harvard going to win this lawsuit, or are they going to lose? Is Tammy going to triumph? So the thing is that it's fun to talk about it afterwards because there's another chapter of this story which wasn't done on, and it still isn't over. Okay.
Yeah.
I don't mind revealing it, even as the filmmaker, just because I think it's important.
And I encourage people to go and watch the clip of the Harvard oral arguments. We originally filed in the lower courts in Middlesex, Massachusetts. And, again, our claim was that Renty and Delia had a property interest in their body and had a property interest as crime victims to the daguerreotypes that were wrestled from them, plundered from them, whatever. The Harvard argued that these are photos and that a subject of a photo. First, they were saying that Renty and Delia didn't have a property interest because they were slaves. They quickly changed that, that slaves couldn't own property, they didn't have a property interest. Then they said that Renty and Delia did not have a property interest because subjects of a photo don't have a vested property interest in the photograph. And so, and again, we're talking about daguerreotypes. These are tangible pieces of property. It's not a photo. And we were also countering that if you kidnap someone, take them to a secure location and force them to disrobe and take pictures of them, whether you're a photographer or not, that's illegal, that's wrong. You can't benefit from your crime. Unfortunately, the judge embraced Harvard's argument and he dismissed our case. We did appeal and it was taken up by the Mass Supreme Court on November 1st. I call it entertainment. I love watching the Harvard attorney get grilled by the Supreme Court justices. He's been my nemesis, but on that day, I really felt sorry for him because he really got lambasted, and it was great to watch. But basically, the judges were very clear that there are limits on a photographer's rights and interest, particularly if they acquire the photography through tortious or criminal acts. You don't get to keep the pictures, the judge kept saying. If you kidnap someone and you make them undress and you don't get to keep those. Ultimately, Harvard, they kept saying that Tammy doesn't have a property interest and I can't bring a case for recovery because I don't have a property interest. And I felt like the attorney was just gaslighting the court because I never had a chance to explain my property interest because I had the rug pulled out from underneath me by the lower court. But my property interest is if Renty and Delia, as the court says, has an inherent property interest in their person, I, as their descendant, have a right to inherit that. And that's my property interest. And that opens the question that so many talk about the generational wealth and the right to inherit and how property has been expropriated from people of color throughout the years. Henrietta Lex, KFC, Jack Daniels, all of these intellectual property and property rights that have been plundered from people where others have gone on to make millions off their work or their property. The linear descendants have a right to inherit that property if the court reverses it and returns that property back to the victims. And so that is basically our argument. And what's unique about my case is, and this is something we haven't talked about, is standing, in that it's, first of all, very hard for a person of color to do the genealogical research and get beyond the early 1900s, going back to the 1800s. But I'm probably one of the very few people in the world that can trace their ancestry definitively back to slaves who have property rights in something valuable. And so it's unique in that regard. And many people have brought reparation cases before, but they've been thrown out for lack of standing because you can't prove your kinship or your connection to the issue of slavery or the enslaved person, but I can. And so fortunately, if the court is fair in reviewing my case must proceed. And if they apply the law, I will prevail.
Let me point out that they haven't, the Massachusetts Supreme Court has not yet ruled. So the film ends with the case being dismissed, and that it's going to be appealed. The appeal has taken place. The arguments have happened.
Okay.
The ruling hasn't been made. So you see, if this were after the film, I would say, go look at our website and you will see the Harvard lawyer being questioned when he didn't expect to be questioned by these judges. And they're asking him those very commonsensical questions. I mean, you really think that a kidnapper takes these pictures, who should own the pictures? They're asking him all these things. You could see it all. But in the film, we hadn't gotten that far.
Sure.
Okay.
The Harvard students have been wonderful. They formed coalitions to free Renty. They have written briefs. And in one brief, this student spells out he's an archivist, but he did the research and he said that Harvard does not have good title, that he's done the research. It's simply not there. He talked about documents of dubious distinction and also provenance. And he said it requires Harvard to have a paper trail that they properly received this gift from someone who had a right to give it to them, and that there is a paper trail associated with every document you have. He said there's nothing there to support Harvard's right to hold the daguerreotype.
So stay tuned.
Yes.
We're going to close with just a brief thought from each of you, David and then Tammy, what you've taken away from making the film and what effect you hope it has out in the world. David?
Well, as I said, when I started this film, I knew this was a very, very important story. And I knew it was that Tammy was going to take it to the end. And I could see that it was a David versus Goliath story. Here's this very brave woman going up against America's oldest, wealthiest, perhaps most prestigious university to claim her heritage and to tell the story of Papa Renty. What happened when I got into the film is I saw that it was a film at the intersection of these amazing issues of white supremacy, of course, of racial injustice, the law and how it operates, morality, cultural restitution, reparations. And I hope people will be inspired by Tammy and her struggle and get to talk about all of these issues. They can choose it. If it goes to the UCLA Law School, they can talk about the law. If it goes to a museum, they can talk about cultural restitution and reparations. It opens up many channels for discussion, and I hope that people can use this film to open their eyes to the way things are.
Well, one of the things that, I am most grateful for is firstly the audience and getting the film out to a wider audience. And one of the things that I hear often is, even from Harvard students, I never knew this story of Louis Agassiz. Up until the day we filed, Harvard was still celebrating and elevating this racist. And it isn't until we filed that they started calling him out for who he was. So the case opened that discussion. Since then, I've been invited to events where they're renaming communities, schools, streets that were originally named Louis Agassiz. Not only are they renaming it, but they're renaming it after a prominent person of color. So I was excited about just the information getting out to people, making them aware, and then them reacting to it in a positive way. And the other thing that I think is important is, and as David touched upon, the myriad of different issues that are relevant today, not sexual exploitation, cultural appropriation. Harvard has appropriated this story. They have appropriated Renty and Delia's legacy, and they want to tell it as they see fit, irregardless of what the facts say. Repatriation. This case has been associated with a number of incidents recently where artifacts are being given back to actually the rightful owners, and beyond that, just the history lesson. There's so much history that's associated with this case, and the history of racism, and how Harvard planted this scientific seed of racism that generated racial animosity all across the world. Historians refer to Louis Agassiz as the father of apartheid, the father of medical apartheid, the father of the eugenics movement. And so this all started right in Massachusetts, and also finally, about Harvard's ties to slavery and the Industrial Revolution and cotton, and the complaint and the case, the history. There's so much to learn from this story and from this film. And when we talk about conversations that could be, it's almost endless, and they're all relevant today.
Thank you both so much for sharing the story and fighting the good fight. We really appreciate you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for inviting us to the festival.
We've been talking with Tammy Lanier, the subject, and the director, David Grubin, of the film Free Renty, Lanier versus Harvard. It screens on Tuesday, April 5th at 4:55 p.m. and Wednesday, April 6th at 11:45 a.m. in the Mimi, Ohio Theater at Playhouse Square. It'll also be part of CIF 46 Streams, which runs online from April 10th through the 17th. To find out more about this year's festival, you can log on to clevelandfilm.org. I'm Dee Perry.
And I'm Aaron Spears.
And we want to thank our sponsor for this event, Wayside Furniture, keeping it local since 1937. And many thanks to you for listening to CIF Speaks.